sense, political wisdom will make it a duty to enact reforms which are appropriate to the ideal of public right, given the present political conditions, but will not use revolutions, when these have been brought about by nature herself, as pretexts for even greater oppression, but rather as the cry of nature summoning it to introduce fundamental reforms so as to bring in a lawful constitution based upon the principles of freedom, the only constitution which endures. Immanuel Kant. To Kant, there's a difference between ruling and governing. Ruling being more about the what, and governing being more about the how. I discussed this in detail in a previous lecture. And to Kant, it does not matter so much what the form of ruling or the form of state is, that is, what the constitution of a state says who should be the ruler, and therefore who should be the lawgiver, a monarch, a senate of aristocrats, or the people. But rather, what matters most to Kant is the form of government. That is, how is the state governed? And here Kant says there are two possibilities. A government can be despotic, or a government can be republican. To Kant, there are three main differences between these two. And that is that first, the people as human beings are free in a republic, which does not mean lawlessness, which does not mean they are free to do whatever, but it means that they are only placed under such laws which they could have given themselves. So laws that only restrict freedom as much as is necessary in order to protect it. And therefore laws that make sense, laws that you can understand, and that therefore you can decide to follow out of your own free will, because you understand them to be reasonable laws. While, on the other hand, the state is despotic if you have laws that restrict freedom more than necessary, if you have laws that do not make sense, that you cannot understand, and therefore laws that you can only follow not voluntarily, but simply because you are forced to, because the state is stronger than you and makes you submit to those laws. And those laws can even be benevolent laws. There can be a paternalistic despotism that tries to make the people happy. It's still despotic, although not tyrannical, because it treats the people like children and not like free, autonomous adults. Second, in a republic, everyone is equal before the law, and everyone can rise to the highest place or fall to the lowest place there is in the state. And everyone can force each other, but only through the law, because everyone is equally dependent on the law. So there are no lords, there are no masters in the state except the state itself. There's no nobility, no slaveholder class, no higher caste or whatever. While the state is despotic, on the other hand, if some people are more dependent than others, or if some people can force others while those others cannot force them. So, as subjects, all people must be equally dependent on the state. And lastly, as citizens, people must be independent. So those people who are independent, who literally do not depend on others, who can live off their own property, which does not have to be physical property. It can be an art, a craft, a science that they possess and that they can use to make money. But they must be able, Kant says, to live off their property. They must not depend on another person, only on the state as such. Then they can be active citizens. And those active citizens should also be independent in the sense that they take part in the lawgiving. They don't have to take part in it directly. It does not have to be a direct democracy. It can be, and Kant actually favored that, it can be a system of representation. But the laws should represent not a particular will of the lawgiver, of this or that group or party, but rather the law should represent the united, fraternally united will of the whole. So those would be the three criteria of the Republic. With the slogan of the French Revolution, you have liberty, equality, and fraternity. All of this I discussed in more detail in my lecture on the Republic and the despotism. Now, to Kant, what matters here especially is that we have separation of powers. And this too I already discussed in its own lecture. The separation of powers, especially between the legislative power, which belongs to the sovereign ruler, and the executive power, the government and the administration of the state, that is to ensure that the state does not turn despotic, that the state is republican. This is what Kant wanted for the state. And he wanted, if not the law-giving power, which is above the law because it gives the law, but the executive power to be under the law so that you can sue the government if it does wrong, if it does despotic acts, and so that you can actually hold the government accountable. This is what Kant wanted, but of course this is not what Kant had. He lived in an age of absolute monarchies. And even today, I talked about this in more detail in my lecture on republicanism and despotism. Even today, we might be somewhat closer to what Kant wanted in several Western states, at least. But we still don't have a republic in the sense of Kant. Which leads to the question how to get there, how to turn a despotic government into a more republican government. And Kant preferred transformation through reform. He preferred, even if it means a slower process, a reform actually undertaken by the government step by step. And what is necessary for this, according to him, is that we have freedom of speech, because freedom of speech allows us to criticize what is, to criticize the existing laws and constitution and so on, and it allows us to bring forth our ideas, our suggestions on how to improve things. And then they can spread, they can be taken up by others, and more people can support a certain improvement or a certain reform until the government is pushed to undertake it. This is the way Kant preferred. And this is what I discussed in my previous lecture on why we don't need philosopher kings, but just freedom of speech. But what if we don't have that? What if the state is so despotic that it doesn't even allow criticism, that it censors you if you try to criticize it. This seems to only leave us with one option, which is to revolt, to violently oppose the state, to start a revolution. And this is what I want to talk about here. Now, Kant did not favor discourse of revolution. I mean, I already said he favored the reform through criticism, through open discourse. And in case that is not possible, in case there's censorship, what Kant would suggest, if things are not too terrible, if the condition in the state is not absolutely unlivable, what he would suggest is just waiting, just accepting things as they are for now, living a quiet life as a good citizen, not necessarily actively supporting the regime, but not revolting against it, and just waiting for better times. Which is indeed what he himself did. I discussed that in more detail in my lecture on Kant's life. But Kant, for the largest part of his life, lived in Prussia under the rule of Frederick II, Frederick the Great, whom he applauded as a monarch that, while having the powers of a despotic ruler, governed in a somewhat republican manner, because he had lifted censorship, particularly in matters of religion, and allowed people to discuss it freely. But then, when Frederick II died, the next king of Prussia was Frederick William II, and with him, obscurantism came back. He was a more reactionary, more waving monarch, and he reinstated censorship. Kant himself got into trouble for his work on religion. And Kant did not rebel against it, but rather he promised the censors, in the name of his king, to not write on matters of religion again. And he didn't. He focused on other works for some years, until Frederick William II died, being replaced by Frederick William III, who was somewhat more liberal again. And then Kant resumed writing on religion, pointing out with a little bit of sophistry that he had given his promise in the name of the king, who now was dead. So now that there was a new king, he was not bound by it anymore. So this is what Kant himself did. Of course, that might not be what people will like to hear. If you live under despotism, if you live in a dictatorship, just keep your head down and wait for better times. So it's important to discuss what Kant had to say about the other option of starting a revolution. Now, Kant would say that a revolution will not bring to Aufklärung, enlightenment, and therefore probably not truly improve things, not truly improve humankind. But this I want to put aside here. This I will come back to when eventually I get to talk about this concept of Aufklärung. Here I want to focus on the matter of revolution from the perspective of the philosophy of right. And I don't want to talk about why it won't improve human beings. I just want to talk about why Kant insisted that a revolution is always an injustice. Yet, why he even went so far as to say that a revolution is always high treason, even against a despot, and even called the revolution murder of the fatherland. Many people might be inclined to strongly disagree. Nowadays, in a Western world that largely traces itself back to the American and French revolutions, revolution has a somewhat positive connotation. And nowadays, most people take it as a given that you have a right to rebel against despotism and tyranny. And people would say that, of course, it was right, all the assassination attempts on Hitler, that, of course, they were justified. They would Kant really want to say that you are not allowed to oppose Hitler or what? Well, to that I will come back later in this lecture. But for now, let me give a general answer. Why? Why do people just take it for granted that you have a right to rebel, that you have a right to revolution? I would say that is not because such a right actually exists, according to reason. And it is not because such a right, even if it did exist, was so obvious, but rather it is because most people do not think in a philosophical manner. They don't ask a reason, they just ask what they would like. And because most people actually don't care about what is right. They don't care about justice or injustice. What they care about is happiness. Let me remind you, I came back to this in many lectures. I first talked about it in my lecture on the imperatives, that according to Kant, all action has to follow one of two principles. There is the eleutheronymy, the free law giving, that is basically the principle of morality and of justice, or there is the eudaimonism, eudaimonia being happiness in ancient Greek. So it's the happiness principle. So Kant is saying, when you act, both in ethics but also in politics, your highest goal is either to do what is right, and you will do that even if it may harm you, even if it may mean sacrificing your own happiness, or your highest goal is attaining happiness, and you will do that even if it means doing something that is wrong, even if it means sacrificing the moral law. Now, there might be many situations where there's no conflict. There might be many situations where you can do both, do what is right, do no wrong, and still be happy. But in situations where conflict arises, you have to pick. And you cannot do both. You can only pick one of those two principles. And as I discussed throughout my lectures on Kant's moral philosophy and Kant's philosophy of right, his whole practical philosophy is about dismissing the principle of eudaimonism, saying it's okay to want to be happy, but only within the bounds of the moral law. You mustn't break the law for happiness. But most people actually do follow the principle of eudaimonism. Most people do it the other way around. And when they say it's okay to revolt against despotism, I would say here this shows. They are just utilitarians that say what matters is the greatest happiness. Now, the despotic or the tyrannical state makes the people unhappy, and so therefore it is okay to rebel against it in the name of the greater good. And those people don't ask whether this is right or not, whether reason agrees with this or not. But let me remind you what I said in the lecture on the Republic and on despotism, and what I briefly repeated at the start of this lecture. I said that a government, according to Kant, is despotic if it takes people's freedom away more than necessary, if it makes laws that restrict freedom. And I said that this is true even if those laws are benevolent laws. Kant says, and he's not the only one, this is what others also discovered in the 18th century, and of course also beyond that, that when a government tries to make people happy, so when a government follows the principle of eudaimonism, it will necessarily turn despotic. Such a government will be a paternalistic government, treating the people like children that don't know what's good for themselves, and will try to force them to be happy. And if that is true, then you would have to say this is not just true for the government. If there are revolutionaries guided by this principle of eudaimonism, saying, well, people are unhappy in this state, through revolution, through toppling the government, through establishing a better government, we will make them happier, they too are being paternalistic. They too treat the people at large. I mean, no revolution will ever be supported by everyone, by the whole people. They too treat the people at large like children that don't know what's good for themselves. And if you consider this, then it's no surprise that very often such revolutions end up installing a new form of despotism. I mean, think of the French Revolution with the Committee of Public Safety or Public Welfare. Think of the communist revolutions, like think of the Soviet Union. If those revolutionaries are guided not by the question what is right, what is just, but by the principle of eudaimonism, by wanting to make people happy, then of course it makes sense that the governments they create after the revolution will be guided by the same principle. But a government guided by such a principle, trying to force happiness on the people, will be a despotic government. If you ask whether a revolution is just or not, you can use the experiment of reason, as Kant calls it, which he proposes for finding out whether an action, whether a maxim, a principle of action is just or not. I discussed this in my lecture on what is justice. And it is what Kant calls the maxim of publicity. He says that you just have to ask yourself, what I plan to do here, could it be made public? And if that would defeat the purpose, if I would foil my own plans by making them public, then they are unjust. Because justice is about publicity. Justice should be that on which everyone can agree, because justice is about giving each his own, while injustice is about not giving someone what is his due, rather taking from someone what is his, harming someone. And of course, that is something that someone who's harmed could never agree to, and therefore it mustn't be made public. So with any action, you can just ask yourself, what would happen if it became public? So if you try to poison someone's food to murder him, well, if you made that publicly known, particularly to that person himself, he would not eat that food anymore, and so you would not be able to murder him anymore. Or if you are trying to steal someone's purse from his pocket in a crowd, if you let him know that, then that will probably prevent you from doing it. So that's how you can know that these things are unjust actions, Kant would say. But if we apply this principle, this maxim of publicity, then it should become immediately clear that a revolution or a revolt, a coup, an assassination attempt, murder of the tyrant, whatever, cannot stand becoming public. I mean, if you were to be part of a circle of conspirators, you have to have secrecy, right? If you were to make it public, yes, we are planning to overthrow the government, then the government would probably take action against you, and therefore you would have foiled your own plan. And I think this is something that no one can disagree with. No one can disagree that overthrowing the government is not a maxim, is not an aim that can stand publicity and still work, but rather it is something that defeats itself if it makes itself public. But I do not expect that will necessarily convince people that overthrowing a government is always an injustice. Rather, I suspect that by this, many people will rather be convinced that Kant's principle, that this maxim of publicity, is after all not a good principle to judge what is just or what isn't just, because they will still think that overthrowing the government can be a just and a good action. Kant's reasoning, however, why the revolution is necessarily unjust makes perfect sense. Because, and here you can go back to my lecture, Why Do We Even Need a State? Kant starts, as was usual in the 18th century for the philosophy of right, Kant starts by imagining the so-called state of nature. So that's a condition where humans would live without state, without laws, without institutions. And this state of nature, by necessity, is a state of injustice, Kant says. And it is a state of constant war, of all against all. Not necessarily constant fighting, but at least constant potential war. Because in this state, since there are no laws, it's not clear what is and what isn't just. I mean, sure, you can use your own reason. You can know that you should not go around, let's say, killing others or whatever. But there can always be conflicts. And even if both sides are well-meaning, there can arise conflicts. Let's say you have a garden and you have an apple tree and a branch grows over the fence, and now an apple falls into another person's garden, into your neighbor's garden. Now you may think it's your apple because it's from your tree, and he may think it's his apple because it's on his garden. So now you have a conflict. And in the state of nature, these conflicts, these disputes cannot be resolved. There is no law clearly saying what belongs to whom. And that is what, to Kant, what the right is always about. It's about the mine and yours. It's about property. And also there is no neutral judge that would be both above you and your neighbor, that you could turn to, who would mediate and decide between you two. So the only way to solve this in the state of nature is war, is fighting one another, is violence. And of course here the winner will not be the person who is in the right, but rather the winner will be he who is stronger. And this is precisely the reason why we should leave the state of nature. It is a necessarily unjust state. And so it is necessary, from the perspective of justice, to leave it, to enter what Kant would call the civil state, where you have a social contract, where you do establish a state and you do establish laws, and then you have courts, and then you can resolve such conflicts, and therefore you end this war of all against all, and you create peace. That is what public right is for, to Kant. So he distinguishes the private right and the state of nature, where you just, in the best case, follow reason, and the public right, which is when you leave the state of nature and you have a right that through laws, through contracts, is publicly declared. And the whole public right only has this one purpose of ending the state of nature, ending the state of war, and creating perpetual peace, which to Kant does not mean absence of all conflict, but it means that conflicts can be resolved in a peaceful and just manner. It means that you don't have to fight, and that what is mine or yours will not be determined by who is stronger. And this is the highest good for the philosophy of right. It's the highest juridical good, this peace, this state of justice. And therefore, under no condition must this state, this civil state, be broken and abolished, and must we go back to the state of nature. But that is precisely what happens in a revolution. Because in a revolution, the people, or at least part of the people, have a conflict with the state as such, or with the ruler of the state. Again, a conflict, as all right is about the mine and yours, about property, a conflict about property. Maybe you think the state is taxing you too much, and that is despotic. And in this case, Kant would say, there cannot be a judge, however. Because, let me remind you of the second principle of the Republic. Again, in detail, I discussed it in the lecture on the Republic. But the second principle was that everyone who is subject of the state must equally be a subject of the state, must equally depend on the state, and must be able to force each other through the state. Never directly, that's what we do in the state of nature, but through the state, right? So if I made a contract with someone, but he ended up breaking the contract, not giving me what he promised through the contract, then I cannot force him directly. I cannot go to his house and steal from him to recompensate myself, but I can force him through the courts. I can sue him. And even if I'm a lowly beggar and he's a minister in the state, I can still sue him. I can still force him through the state. That's what the second principle of the Republic, equality before the law, equal dependence of the subjects on the state means. However, excluded here is the sovereign, is the lawgiver, which in monarchy would be the king, in aristocracy would be the Senate, in democracy would be the people as such. The lawgiver, precisely because he gives the laws according to which everyone is just and through which everyone can be forced, the lawgiver as such is above the law. He determines what is and isn't just. And so therefore his own actions, the laws he gives, cannot simply be judged to be unjust. I mean, by what standard would you judge them? You would have to have a higher law by which to judge them. But then the lawgiver who gave that higher law would be above the law and could not be judged. So, for that reason, the lawgiver, the sovereign as such, cannot be subject to the laws, cannot depend on the state. And I discussed this in more detail in my lecture on sovereignty and the separation of powers, by the way. And for this very reason, Kant would say, when you have a conflict with this lawgiver, there is no judge to turn to, because the lawgiver is sovereign, which literally comes from the Latin superanus, above everything. So he is, as Kant says, the overlord in the state. And if he had to submit to some judge, then that judge would be the true sovereign, the true overlord. And then he, because he would have no judge above him, would be the one who cannot be judged. But this means that if you have a conflict with the sovereign himself, not with someone within the state, this cannot be resolved through the laws, through courts. Rather, if you now rebel, if you now start a revolution, you are essentially fighting a war, right? That is what a revolution is, a war between the people and the state, or the ruler of the state. And this means, by the act of starting a revolution, no matter how the revolution ends, but by the act of starting the revolution, you essentially abolish the state. You re-enter the state of nature. Now, when the revolution is over, a state might be created again. I mean, either you lose and the old regime stays in power and will reassert its power, or you win and you topple the old regime and then you erect a new regime. In both cases, you have a state again. But in the meantime, even if it's a quick revolution, but in the meantime, you did destroy the state and you re-entered the state of nature, the state of the war of all against all. And now the revolutionaries are fighting with the ruler and the loyalists. And as is always the case in the state of nature, the winner will not necessarily be he whose cause is more just, but rather the winner will be he who is the strongest. But this is precisely, Kant would say, what we don't want. This is precisely why we had to leave the state of nature in the first place. Because we don't want to live in a lawless jungle where the strongest rule. We want to live in a condition of the rule of law, of justice, of peace. And for that reason, he says, the revolution as such is always unjust, because it is always breaking the law and always re-entering the state of nature. Again, of course, not everyone agrees with that. Like here in Germany, our constitution actually includes a right of opposing the state. That, of course, was included for historical reasons. And the reasoning given nowadays is, well, if someone like the Nazis were to rise to power again, you have a right to oppose them. But of course, putting something like that into the constitution, I mean, it sounds nice, but it does not make so much sense, right? Because if you had someone like the Nazis rising to power again, they would, of course, not accept that there's a right to resistance. And if someone were to resist, they would probably kill those people and not accept those people saying, oh, but the Constitution said we had the right to resist you. And on the other hand, if there was no such right in the Constitution, and we did end up in a despotic regime again, and people were to resist, and were to topple the regime, and were to bring back freedom, then surely no one would afterwards put those people into prison for having resisted when they had no right to. You can be sure that whoever ends up in power will take the other side to court. If the Nazis are in power, they will take those who revolt to court and judge and punish and execute them as traitors. And if the Nazis are defeated, they will be taken to court by those who defeated them and will be judged as criminals. Here you can see precisely that this is not about justice, this is about the state of nature, the war of all against all, and the strongest will win, and the strongest will make his own justice, will make his own laws, will say that his side was right. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but you don't need a law saying you have a right to resistance. Everyone who successfully resisted in history managed to afterwards make laws justifying his resistance and criminalizing those he resisted against. I mean, of course, the reason we have such a law in Germany is also, it's not because anyone is naive enough to think if Nazis were in power, they would respect such a law. But it's so that afterwards people like Eichmann cannot say, oh, I just followed orders. How could I have resisted? It would have been illegal. I had to follow these orders. But rather so that we then can say, no, actually, you had a right and even a duty to resist. At the same time, here in Germany, we have this law. In the US, you have, of course, lots of people that have a fetish for guns and that are obsessed with their Second Amendment, their right to own their own guns. And here also the justification that is given often is that people say, well, if the government were to turn despotic, then if we are unarmed and we could not resist, we could not defend ourselves. But if we own guns, then we can defend ourselves against the government and we could topple the despot. Of course, now, thanks to Trump, you see that this was always a lie. I mean, the very people who always said this are the people supporting the despot. They are not right now using their guns to oppose the despot. And also at the same time, you know that even if they were, this would not work, right? Some people with guns cannot just topple the government. That's not how it works, especially when the government has the better guns, when the military, the National Guard, and so on are armed way more. But still, the reasoning is we need those guns in order to rebel if necessary. And mind you, here in Germany, we do have this constitutional right to resist, but there's no right to private gun ownership. I mean, some with very heavy restrictions, some people like hunters can own guns, but in general, people here don't own guns. This, of course, makes no sense. I mean, rightfully, the Americans could criticize this and say, well, how can you have a right to resistance, but not a right to own the tools you would need to resist? And they're right, that's inconsistent. On the other hand, with Kant, we can say to such Americans, you're right, if you had a right to resist, you would have a right to own guns, but you do in fact not have a right to resist. And therefore you also don't need your guns. Therefore, this the whole justification you give for why you need to have a Second Amendment is void. And as a side note, I would say that Kant's philosophy of right actually can be helpful in better understanding this American mentality. Because it's not just about the guns, right? It runs deeper. There is this, let's say, American anti-etatism, this American distrust of the state. Now, you can, of course, try to explain this historically. You can point out that the United States were founded through a revolt against the state, which was judged to be despotic. And this was, of course, by the laws that existed back then, illegal. And this was, of course, a breach of the civil state as such. This was, of course, taking people for a time into the state of nature. And if it had not been successful, the American War of Independence, then those who forked it, the founding fathers, would of course have been executed by Great Britain as traitors, which, according to Kant, would have been all right. But they were successful, they revolted successfully against their state, but this left the American people with this distrust towards the state because they were burst through a revolt against state despotism. There's always this suspicion that the state could turn despotic again, and another such revolt could be necessary. Add to this that many people that came to America were fleeing from the state in Europe, where, for example, small Protestant sects that had been persecuted in Europe. Add to this that for a long time in large parts of the US at the frontier, people were on their own. People were somewhat fending for themselves, defending themselves, not so much depending on the state and on the state's protection. Add to that the decades of the Cold War and the anti-communist propaganda. And of course, to the average American, communism means having a state. And the state doing something, right? Like there are these people that will claim that Europe is socialist because we have health insurance. But no matter the origins of this mentality, the mentality as such is this distrust towards the state. And Kant distinguishes these two types of freedom. I discussed that in more detail in my lecture on what is freedom. The wild or savage freedom, which is completely lawless, completely unrestricted, which is the freedom that you have in the state of nature. And then there is the civilized freedom, the freedom under the law. Of course, there can also be a law that is despotic, that takes away your freedom. But the freedom under the law is when you have a law that actually protects freedom. Because the paradoxical thing is that the wild freedom, where you can really do anything, destroys itself, right? If there's not even a law prohibiting murder, well, then you're free to murder people, but they are also free to murder you, and you will probably not stay free for long, right? So it's good to take some freedom away, because that actually ensures that freedom will remain. And Kant says if people that live under the wild, under the savage freedom, are offered the law, a rational law, if you attempt to bring them under a law that would restrict their freedom, but only to protect it and secure it, and they then oppose that irrationally, they would rather keep their savage freedom, even though it destroys itself, then they are barbarian. This is basically one definition of the barbarian Kant gives. The barbarian is what the savage turns into when he starts resisting civilization. If he's just being uncivilized, he's just a savage. But the moment civilization is offered him and he actively resists it, he is a barbarian. So you could say that there is this barbarism in the US. Of course, not just in the US. I mean, to some degree, it's everywhere. Kant also says this, and I discussed it in previous lectures, like my lecture on why we need a state, my lecture on justice. But in the US, very much so, there is this mentality of wanting to keep your wild, your savage freedom, not wanting any restrictions of the freedom, no matter how rational, no matter how necessary to secure freedom. And this distrust that the state is not basically the protector of freedom and the one who institutes justice and peace, but rather that the state is the enemy, that the state is an usurper, an oppressor. And it is from this mentality that this fetish some Americans have for weapons comes from. But of course, also other parts of the US culture can be explained through the same mentality. I mean, just take the pop culture and the important role that superheroes play there, right? All these comics and Marvel movies and so on about these superheroes who are basically vigilantes, basically lawless people that don't accept the civil state and the justice, the peace it brings, but rather that still live in the state of nature together with the supervillains, where not justice but strength determines the outcome. And I mean, these stories that are so popular in the US, I would say they are very typically American. I mean, of course, because of the cultural dominance, we also now watch superhero movies, but it is noteworthy that I don't know of any other society in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, whatever, um, where this is such a big original thing. Like they have their own comics or movies or whatever on superheroes that are equally big, equally culturally important. No, this seems to be very much an American thing. And behind it is this idea that the state is not enough, that there are things, there are threats that the state cannot deal with, the state cannot ensure peace or justice, but rather it needs strong, independent, righteous individuals, heroes, who will take matters in their own hands. And this is also what we should keep in mind, this mentality, when analyzing Trump and the MAGA movement. Because now this often gets called fascism, because people will call everything that is far right fascist, but I would claim that there are different types of far right. Far right is not just a synonym for fascist. And I'm not saying there are no fascist elements there. I'm not saying this could not lead to fascism. But I am saying that right now it's not simply fascism. Because fascism is about what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, coordination or synchronization, making everyone the same, making everyone submit to the whole, to something higher than himself, to which he will submit himself, making everyone march in lockstep. And this sort of collectivism is very much the opposite to this American hyper-individualism. And it is not what large parts of the MAGA movement want or what Trump promises them. He's not saying, I'm going to be your big leader, your Führer, and you're all going to follow me in lockstep. But rather he is saying, look at me. I do whatever I want. I break the rules. I don't care for the laws. I don't even care for decency, for decorum. And you can be like me. Maybe on a smaller scale, but you can be like me. You can just not care. You can just say fuck you to everyone and do whatever you want. So what he's promising is exactly bringing back the state of nature, right? Like destroying the state, as he started together with Musk after he was re-elected. And so this is not fascism. This is just the typical American liberalism on steroids. This is just the logical consequence of this liberalism or libertarianism. And here I want to point out that the Aufklärung is often taken to be liberal, to even be the origin of liberalism. But that is just because people don't distinguish between actual Aufklärung and Ausklärung, masquerading as Aufklärung, so between enlightenment and entwilightment. The actual Aufklärung, in fact, was not and is not and never will be liberal, but rather it is rational. But back to the question of evolution. People sympathizing with evolutions will, of course, only think of whatever they think is a bad government or a bad ruler being toppled. Like they will say, oh, but the Nazi regime, wouldn't it have been good to start a revolution against them? But the issue is, of course, that in theory, any government can be toppled through a revolution. including those you think are good and rightful and just governments. I mean, just remember that only a few years ago, there was an attempted revolution or coup in the US, right? After Trump lost the election, there were MAGA people storming the Capitol in the US. Likewise, here in Germany, we had something a little similar, so less large scale and less consequential. But during COVID, we had protesters, anti-lockdown, anti-vaxxer protesters in front of the parliament, and a few of them tried storming the parliament building. They were stopped at the entrance, didn't do any harm, but still. And also here in Germany, not so long ago, we had some Reichsbürger. So the Reichsbürger are a particular brand of far-right conspiracy theorists that think that the German Reich, so the empire, never actually was abolished after the Second World War, and that it still exists, and that the Federal Republic of Germany is actually an illegitimate construct of the victors. It's just a way to occupy Germany, but not a real state, and so they call themselves Reichsbürger, citizens of the empire. And some of them were planning for a coup. They were planning for terrorist attacks. They had plans to kidnap a minister. They had hoarded weapons because they're actually soldiers and policemen that are part of the Reichsbürger scene. Now they were stopped. They were imprisoned. But still, they think that this government that we have is illegitimate and wanted to topple it. And that's precisely the problem, right? If you say that revolutions are at all allowed, that they are at all just, well, as I said, a revolution means that you leave the civil state, the state where there are laws that determine what is and isn't just. You necessarily have to, because according to these laws, it is never okay to overthrow the government. Why would the government make laws that say you can overthrow us? So you are necessarily breaking the laws. You are necessarily re-entering the state of nature, and in the state of nature, everyone is his own judge. So now it's up to your judgment whether this government is legitimate and just or not. And in the end, it's only strength that will decide who comes out on top. So anyone could start a revolution against any government. And also, this also goes, of course, for revolutionary governments, right? I mean, who's to stop anyone from overthrowing a government that only came into being after another government was just overthrown? And I mean, this has also happened in history, right? Think of Egypt, that got rid of its tyrant Mubarak, but then the army, which of course had served under that old tyrant, was not happy with where things were going, and ended up in a coup overthrowing the new government. Now, who's to say here who is and who isn't right if you allow revolutions at all? It can go forever, and there is nothing but strength, but whoever happens to win, which can decide who is right, because you can be sure that no matter who comes out on top, they will end up legitimizing their new rule, and they will end up punishing those whom they overthrew and saying that they were usurpers or traitors or whatever. And to Kant, the state of nature is the worst thing there is. He would say that it is better to live under a law, even if it is an imperfect, a somewhat despotic law. And I mean, every law is imperfect to some degree. There is no state which is a fully just republic. So if you were to allow revolutions, then in any state a revolution could be justified, because, I mean, where would you draw the line? At what degree of injustice would it not be okay anymore? So yeah, Kant would say that it is better to live even under a somewhat unjust, somewhat despotic law than to live in a state of complete lawlessness, which the state of nature is. Because the law protects you. Even if it's somewhat unjust, maybe it doesn't protect you fully then, maybe it does not protect you enough, but at least it protects you somewhat. But in the state of nature, you are not protected at all, right? I mean, take the history of certain oppressed groups, for example, women. Here in Germany, it was only a little less than 30 years ago, only in 1997, that rape within marriage got prohibited. Till then, a husband could legally rape his wife, and there was nothing she could do. And in fact, we still have active politicians nowadays that about 30 years ago, when there was a vote on making rape within marriage illegal, voted against it. In fact, one of those politicians is our current chancellor, which probably does not shine the best of lights on the German society, which simply doesn't care. I mean, this is not something that is usually discussed in the public discourse. It is not something that journalists remind us of often. Like, people don't care who 30 years ago was in favor of rape in marriage. But whatever. The point is that this was clearly unjust. This was clearly despotic towards the women. But now, still, in this condition, there were laws that protected women in other cases, right? Rape within marriage was allowed, but at least outside of marriage, rape was forbidden. Also, of course, other things were forbidden, like killing women, physically harming women, and so on. Now, what the women's movement did, is, of course, they criticized this, they pushed for prohibiting rape within marriage, which they were eventually successful at, and which is just what Kant wants. But imagine that instead they had said, okay, here we have an injustice, therefore we don't have to accept such a government, such a state, such laws, therefore we will start a revolution. Well, in that case, every law would have stopped being a law for a time. They would have created a lawless condition. And now, not only rape within marriage would have been possible, but it would have been possible for people, if they happen to be stronger, to do to women, and of course also to everyone else, whatever crimes they want to do to them. Or likewise, take the gay movement, right? Of course, it was despotic that for a long time the age of consent for homosexual sex in Germany was higher than for heterosexual sex. And before that, homosexual sex was forbidden altogether, was illegal. You could be imprisoned for it. That was, of course, also despotic. But even then, not everything was despotic. Gay people, if they were not caught having sex, just like everyone else, could not just be stolen from or could not just be murdered. And they even had free speech, so they could at least protest and demand the laws be changed and gay intercourse being legalized. Imagine once again if instead they had tried to overthrow the government to force better laws into place. Then during that process of overthrowing the government, not only would there not have been a law yet protecting gay sex, there would have been no law protecting human life either. They could have been killed during trying to overthrow the government. And so this is Kant's point. He is saying that an imperfect civil state where you have some laws, some protection from injustice, is still better than the completely lawless jungle where it's just about strength, where you have no protection at all. And this is precisely where a revolution leads you to, at least for a short time. And so Kant's position is, if you overthrow a despot or a tyrant, you are of course not committing an injustice against him specifically, but you're still committing an injustice as such. This is something I already discussed way earlier when I talked in my other lecture on the categorical imperative, that Kant says, of course, no one can complain if he is treated according to his own maxim. So the murderer cannot complain if he's being murdered. The thief cannot complain if he is being stolen from. The liar cannot complain if he is being lied to, because we could always reply, well, if you think that lying is wrong, then why did you lie? So by lying or by stealing or by murdering, you basically made the statement to the world that you think this is okay. So why should it not be okay when others do it to you? But Kant stresses that this does not give us the right to treat a bad person badly, because while we would not do an injustice against him, we would still do an injustice as such and against humanity. And this also goes for the despot. By overthrowing, by resisting a despot, he himself cannot complain. That would be ridiculous if he complained, oh, they're being unjust to me, because he was first being unjust to them by oppressing them. But you are committing an injustice as such, Kant would say, because you are destroying justice as such. You are destroying the state for everyone, not just for the despot. And you are forcing people back into the state of nature, which by the very definition is the state of injustice. And many people might not see this, might not recognize that this is necessarily what happens during a revolution. But here it is important to think as a philosopher, and that means thinking in principles, not empirically. So not asking, okay, what did happen in this or that revolution? Who was hurt? How long did it take? But rather reason, as I explained in my lecture on what is reason. Reason is the faculty of principles, Kant says. So thinking rationally means thinking from a principle. And in principle, a revolution destroys the old state, throws people back into the state of nature, And then whoever comes out on top creates a new state. Empirically, in the sensual world, in some cases, this might go very fast. I mean, maybe you have a coup where people are storming the palace of the tyrant, and they immediately defeat him and kill him, and then with tyrant's blood still on their hands, they proclaim the new government. And also, empirically, of course, the revolutionaries might reaffirm many of the old laws, right? Because not every single law was wrong and unjust. I mean, maybe there was a law in place that said murder is forbidden, stealing is forbidden. They will then keep those laws. But still, in principle, there is a state of complete lawlessness, where there are no laws at all between the overthrowing of the old government and the institution of the new government. And you cannot really know how things will turn out, right? I mean, it is possible that the new revolutionary government will turn despotic again, will maybe turn out to be even worse than the one that was overthrown, like happened in France, or like happened later in Muscovy. Or it may be that the revolutionaries, after having defeated the old government, will turn on one another because they disagree on who should rule now or what the new government should look like. Or it may be that they don't manage to overthrow the old government, but the old government also doesn't manage to defeat them, and that the whole country is thrown into a violent civil war where everyone can now murder and rape and loot and so on. I mean, just think of Syria. No one in their right mind will deny that Assad was a bloody tyrant, and that no injustice was done to him by overthrowing him, and that no injustice would have been done to him even if he had been killed off like some rat in some hole, like his colleague Gaddafi over in Libya. But the issue is that trying to overthrow him turned into 13 years of bloody war with other outside forces getting involved and so on. And so you might very well ask, even from the perspective of happiness, and let me remind you, it is the eudaimonism, the happiness principle, not the principle of justice, which makes people think that revolution is okay in the first place. You could ask from the principle of happiness, would it not have been maybe better? Would it not have been the lesser evil if no revolution had been attempted? If this tyrant had been left in place? And this is precisely the issue that Kant sees. This is precisely why he is critical of revolutions. Many people, when they would judge a revolution to be just and good, would only ask the question, well, this government that this revolution attacks and overthrows, should it stay, or would it be better for this government to go away? But to Kant, that's not the only or the main question we should ask. Even if you answer this question with yes, even if you say this is a despotic government and it would be better to be rid of it, Kant would pose the question, okay, maybe, but what will be the price for getting rid of it? And is the price really worth it? I mean, we are now used to think positively of the French Revolution, to think of it as a success story. Here we get talked it in school in history class extensively, and it basically gets talked as this moment where our modern states or modern democracies started. But we should remember that it took several decades, almost a century, before there was some sort of lasting democracy. I mean, the French Revolution happened in 1789, but at first you had the terror, the reign of terror. Then you had the essentially dictatorship, the despotism of Napoleon. You had Napoleon being defeated, and the old regime, so the old royal family of the Bourbons, being brought back into power. Then 1830, you had a new revolution, bringing into power as a new king Louis Philippe, and then he in turn was overthrown in 1848, with a brief attempt at establishing a republic, which ended with Napoleon III becoming the new emperor, and then this empire ending after the defeat in 1871, when it was defeated by the German states under the leadership of Prussia. And only then, with the Third Republic, did you have some sort of somewhat lasting democracy. Of course, still not a very good, a very just state. I mean, the Third Republic was the state of the Dreyfus affair, amongst other things. But that's at least how long it took. And how much blood was spilled in the meantime, both in France under the guillotine and outside of France on the battlefields of Europe. Well, enough blood, Kant would say, that a sensible man, were he boldly to hope to execute it successfully the second time, would never resolve to make the experiment at such cost. And it is very clear that Kant himself was such a person as he describes here. And that is what we have to respect and revere him for. That he did not have the slightest bit of utilitarianism in him. He had enough morality, enough reverence for humanity to say, no, I will not, for some higher good that I want to reach, bloody my hands. I will not commit crimes in the name of some future justice. And this, unfortunately, is not a more widespread posture. I mean, nowadays, I find it disgusting how careless, how dismissive certain people who are for revolutions talk about the sacrifices it takes. I mean, you have certain communists that will openly say, yeah, sure, it will take violence, people will die, but that's what it takes. Well, if that's what it takes, maybe I don't want it. Or look how certain people, both certain leftists and also Hamas themselves, talk about the 7th of October and the consequences it had for the Palestinians themselves, for Gaza. Now, of course, I'm not amongst those people who say that Palestinians should not or could not resist. It's disgusting that we always get told that Israel has a right to self-defense, but never that the Palestinians have a right to resistance. And sure, people have a point when they say, well, what else could they have done? Right? They tried everything else, including peaceful protests like the Great March of Return, where IOF soldiers made it a sport to shoot at certain body parts, to shoot kneecaps, for example, or to shoot them directly in the head or whatever. So the side of Israel and its allies, the genocider side, really has no right to even open its mouth at all. Really has no right to in any way attack them, to in any way blame or judge them. But still, when I hear people talking so carelessly about the consequence of genocide, saying stuff like, oh yeah, that's what it takes, the fight for freedom requires sacrifices. Well, tens of thousands of children were sacrificed. And no one asked them if they want to be sacrificed. So at some point, you do have to ask, is the price you pay worth it? And everyone who is in favor of revolutions, who will say revolutions are just and justified against despotism, I would dare to tell me of the successful revolutions. Of course, I'm not talking here about failed ones. It would be unfair to judge those, because we cannot know how things would have turned out if things would really have improved if those revolutions had been successful. But tell me of the successful revolutions that did manage to overthrow the old government, where things actually became better and more just afterwards, instead of just one despotism being replaced with another, possibly a worse one. I'm not saying there are no success stories at all. I mean, I live in Germany, and Eastern Germany did have a peaceful revolution, toppling the despotic government, and it turned out somewhat all right. I mean, there's lots that could be said here. It's probably not a regular case, because we don't know how things would have turned out if the state had stayed independent, and if they themselves had to have would have had to erect a new government. I mean, the state was almost immediately taken over by another already functioning state. And also, there's a lot to criticize here, of course. I mean, Eastern Germany was effectively colonized. What economy they had was destroyed. They were taken over. I mean, even to this day, you will not find many editors-in-chief or many leading politicians or leading professors or leading CEOs in Germany that are from East Germany, including in East Germany itself. Like, the people in charge there are mostly Westerners. And then, of course, many East Germans by now have completely turned against this state that overtook them. Many of them are now voting for the far right. So there would be a lot that could be said here. But still, we can say, okay, that revolution was successful. It did not lead to new tyranny, at least. Likewise, of course, the revolution of dignity in Ukraine in 2014 was a peaceful and successful revolution, largely. And the Ukrainians are certainly commendable. Ever since their independence, they constantly have fought for more freedom, for more justice, for more republicanism, for integrating with Europe. which is also not only why I have such respect for them, but why I so deeply despise anyone who would attack these Ukrainian people and who goes for these conspiracy theories that, it's all just a coup of the CIA, and in fact, bloody aggressor and tyrant Putin is in the right. It says a lot about a person if that person is against the revolution of dignity of all things. What it says about him is that he must be an enemy of human dignity. But even so, you can maybe name one or two examples. If you really think about all these successful revolutions, a lot of them did not have such good results. I mean, I already mentioned the French Revolution that very quickly led to the reign of terror. You can also think of the revolution in Muscovy that first led to civil war between the red and white armies, and then later to Stalin's totalitarian regime. Or likewise, you can think of the revolution in Iran, which sure managed to overthrow the Shah, who certainly was a terrible despot. But then it led to the new despotism, the clerical despotism of the mullahs. And more recently, you had the so-called Arab Spring, which did not lead to such good results either, right? I mean, either it led to many years of bloody civil war, like in Syria, or like in Egypt. It did manage to mostly peacefully and with not so much blood spilled overthrow the despot. But now you have a new despotism that is worse than the one that was overthrown. So, all in all, I think the number of successful revolutions, in the sense that they were somewhat peaceful and that things actually became somewhat better afterwards, is quite little, which should maybe make us, as Kant was, more careful about revolutions. I will point out that all of this is not simply Kant's individual opinion, but rather this is the position of philosophy as such. It's not just Kant who rather accepted the Prussian despotism under Frederick William II and chose not to write on religion for a time, because while he did think that this was wrong, that there should be no censorship, he also thought that resisting the state, resisting the laws would be even more wrong. Because, yes, there should be no censorship, but there also shouldn't be a state of nature where everyone is his own judge and his own lawgiver and only does whatever he wants and whatever he deems right, because where would that get us? No, it's not just Kant. I mean, you can go back to the very beginning of the history of philosophy, to Socrates, right? Who was executed by Athens, was made to drink poison, and his friends urged him to flee to save his life. But his position was that while his execution was unjust, having a state, having a government, having laws as such is just, and acting against those, creating a state of chaos and anarchy where everyone is his own judge would be even more unjust. And so, in a way, he sacrificed himself for the law. And you would have to be very unphilosophical You would have to be very selfish and only driven by your sensual self-interest to not consider that a very sublime deed. Which is not to say that it is the highest deed that could be done, but still it is something that merits some respect. So I do want to stress that Kant's position towards revolutions is complex. It's not as simple as just, Kant was against revolutions. For one, not everything that we would call a revolution, Kant called a revolution. In fact, the revolution of revolutions, the French Revolution, was not a revolution to Kant. And therefore, he said that it was not unjust, that it was justified. Why is that? Well, if you know the history of the French Revolution, you will know that it started with the king, Louis XVI, who ruled as an absolute monarch. So, according to Kant's philosophy of right, he was the sovereign, he was the sole lawgiver. Because he had financial problems and he wanted tax reforms that he wanted people to agree to, he assembled the Estates General. So the assembly of the three estates, the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. And he wanted them to agree to his tax reforms, essentially. And then this ended with mainly the third estate saying that this was unfair. The other two estates had way too much power, even though they were way, way smaller. And then the whole revolution took its course. Well, to Kant, the point is that he says Louis XVI basically abolished the old regime himself. Surely that was not his intention, surely that is not what he had wanted to, but that is what he did. Because he was the sovereign, he had the sole law-giving power, and now he's calling for this assembly to basically make a law. Thereby, Kant says, he passed the sovereignty to the people, to the representatives of the three estates, thereby passing the sovereignty from an absolute monarch to the people, to a democracy. And he had intended to only do this for this one case, this tax reform, essentially. But that's not how it works, Kant says. He says now that the assembly of the three estates essentially was the sovereign, or the representative of the sovereign, the three estates as a whole being the new sovereign. They were totally within their rights to also change other laws. It was no absolute monarchy anymore. The absolute monarch had made himself a merely constitutional monarch, and therefore they could continue with this. So this is quite clever of Kant. You could maybe say it's a bit of sophistry to, in his day, justify the revolution. But he is saying that accidentally it was the sovereign himself who revolutionized things. And that is always okay. That is always justified, because Kant's whole point is that a subject of the state has no right to rebel against the sovereign, because the sovereign makes the laws. The sovereign decides what is and isn't right. And if you rebel, then you are rebelling against the law as such, and you are re-entering the state of nature, at least for a time. But that does not mean that the sovereign himself cannot make new laws, even laws that abolish his sovereignty. I mean, likewise here in Germany, there is a clause actually in our constitution, a final law at the end of the constitution, where it says that this constitution will be in place until the German people give themselves in a general vote a new constitution. Because after the Second World War, when two states were founded, the Western state, the Federal Republic, of course wanted reunification. And so they made sure to make everything a bit preliminary. That's why the constitution that they came up with was not called the Constitution, and to this day it's not officially called Constitution, it's called the Basic Law. And the very Constitution says that after reunification, whenever that may be, this Basic Law can be replaced with a new Constitution in a general vote. Now, that vote never took place, right? The Eastern German state just joined the Western German state, just sort of was swallowed by it, instead of both of them coming together to form a completely new state with a new constitution. And our politicians never made us vote on a new constitution, which also is not unconstitutional, right? Because the law does not read that after reunification there has to be a vote on a new constitution. It just says that there can be. But my point is that right now the constitution has some basic laws that cannot be changed, like human dignity is untouchable, everyone has a right to live, there is no death penalty, and so on. Everyone is equal. The constitution itself says that these cannot be changed, even if you had a majority in parliament of 100%. It would still be unconstitutional to change this. Yes, within the framework of this constitution. But the constitution also offers this possibility of abolishing itself and being replaced with a new constitution, which of course theoretically could also have new laws. And that would not be unconstitutional. That would not be a revolution, right? But rather that would be the sovereign power of the state deciding itself to give up its sovereignty. In this case, the sovereignty would be given to the people at large, who would vote on a new constitution. And that within Kant's philosophy of right would be okay, would not be an illegal revolution. But that's not the only ambivalence or nuance when it comes to Kant and revolution. It's not just that in a specific case, like in the case of France, he says technically this was not a revolution and therefore it was okay because the sovereign passed on his own sovereign power, made somebody else sovereign. He also says if you have a revolution, even one that should not have been done, that is unjust, once that it started, you should see it through and you should not fight it. He says at some point that the Republic, in the process of becoming, is like Pandora's box. It is full of evils that come out when you open it, but at the very bottom of the box lies hope. And so Kant says, opening the lid of the box is a sacrilege that brings a lot of evil and terror upon the world and therefore should not have been done. So likewise, when you live in a despotic state, starting the process of this state becoming a republic starting a revolution is like opening the lid, and it unleashes all sorts of evils and terrors upon the people. But while the sacrilege of opening Pandora's box maybe should not have been done, once it was done and the evils were out there in the world, it would have been an even more terrible sacrilege to close the lid on hope, to not let hope out. And likewise, once a revolution is started, once the despotic state starts turning into a republic, no matter how much it may cost, it would be an even more terrible crime than starting the revolution was, to just stop it, to just be a reactionary that brings back the old regime. Because then you would destroy hope as such. Kant would say whatever terrible things there might happen in the long, maybe years or decades long process of republicanization, at least there's hope that at the end there will be justice. And I mean, history has proven Kant right? The French Revolution did unleash all sorts of evils, not just up in France, but up in Europe and the world. And a lot of blood was spilled. But during the whole time, even during the worst reign of terror, there was always the hope that this would lead to something truly better, which gave many people, including Kant, such an enthusiasm for this revolution. Of course, someone could see sense in all I said, but still feel uneasy when he hears Kant say or read Kant write things like he who cares more about the right of humanity than about his own private welfare will, even under tyranny, not resist, but rather accept it, because silent obedience and patience will only contradict your own subjective purpose, which is your happiness, but resistance would contradict the objective purpose of reason, which is the right, the law. And therefore, if this maxim became a universal law, and that's, of course, what the categorical imperative always asks us, right? I discussed that in its own lecture. We should always ask, can my maxim become a universal law? The maxim of resistance, since it contradicts the purpose of reason, since it contradicts the right, turned into a universal law, would contradict itself, right? If it was a law that everyone always resisted, always revolted against the state, whenever he is discontent with anything, then that would destroy the state and therefore the right, therefore justice as such, and then we would have even more reason to be discontent. So that maxim would destroy itself. People, even if they don't have a rational argument against it, might feel uneasy with this, because they will still think, but is Kant here preaching that we should always follow the law no matter how unjust it is? Is he preaching that even the Nazi regime should have been followed? And surely there have been people accusing Kant of precisely that, of preaching a morality of blind obedience, and all his talk of following your duty, that it led to people like Eichmann saying, well, I did just that, right? It was my duty to obey the Führer's orders, and I only obeyed orders. It's not my fault that they were bad orders. But that would be a gross misunderstanding of Kant. Kant distinguishes between the resistance and defiance. The latter nowadays we would probably call passive resistance. So what Kant is saying is it is unjust to do active resistance, to actually revolt, to actually try to overthrow the government, to actually break the law, because then you're throwing everyone, for a time at least, into the state of nature. But he is saying that it can be right, it can even be your duty to engage in passive resistance. That is to not follow every order, every command given to you. Kant says when the state commands you to do something, and I mean, if it's something moral, then you should do it anyways, even if there was no state, right? If the state tells you, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, or, for example, we have a law in Germany that if someone needs help, then you have to help. Like if someone is in mortal danger and you can help. If you see a car crash and someone is bleeding out on the street and you just walk by and don't call an ambulance, then you can be charged for that if he dies, because maybe he wouldn't have died if you called an ambulance. So here the state commands something that Kant would say is morally necessary. So something that you should do anyway. So of course you should obey the state. It's also possible, Kant says, that the state commands something which is not morally necessary, but which is morally possible. That is, it is an action that you don't have to do according to the moral law, but it doesn't contradict the moral law, right? So maybe the state commands you to drive on the right and not on the left. Now that's not morally necessary. It would also be moral if we all drove on the left instead of on the right. And maybe you personally think that would be better. Okay, then you can try to change the law. You can petition, you can criticize the law publicly. But as long as this law is in place, since it is morally possible to drive on the right, you should obey that law, right? Or if the state takes money from you for something that you don't really want to pay for. So, for example, here, if you have an apartment, for each apartment you have to pay a certain monthly sum for the public broadcasting service, because you could have a TV in your apartment. And there are many criticizing that, and fair enough, you could criticize it. You could try to change this so that the public broadcasters are abolished and there's only private TV. But at least it's even the people criticizing it would have to admit that this is not morally impossible to do. It is not immoral as such to have public broadcasting channels and to pay for them. So as long as this law is in place, Kant would say you have to obey. But there's also the third possibility, that the state commands something that is morally impossible to do. It might be physically possible, but it's not morally possible. So you should not do it. It's absolutely immoral. And in this case, it's not just all right, it is in fact your moral duty to not obey the state. Kant gives examples. He says any sort of force of religion. So if the state tries to force you into a certain faith, to take part in that faith or whatever, even though you don't believe in it, then not only can you resist, you should resist. Likewise, if the state commands unnatural sins, Kant says, and here he means certain sexual acts like sex with animals or sex with children. If the state commands you to do this, you should resist. And likewise, assassinations, Kant says. If the state tells you to just kill somebody, not only can you have to refuse to do it. And Kant gives an anecdote that he approves of the commander of La Rochelle in France, which during the wars of the Huguenots was an important city, a bastion of the Protestants, and there was the night of Bartholomew, where many of the Protestants of the Huguenots were killed, and Kant relates that the commander of La Rochelle refused the king's order to have the Huguenots killed. Now, this might not be historical. Kant does not give a name, and if you try to research this, it seems that Kant somewhat confused different accounts, and there was not this specific commander of La Rochelle. But that's besides the point. I mean, it's not important here whether this happened or not. What's important is that Kant approved of this. So that he is saying, okay, if the king gives an unlawful, an unjust order to kill people just for their faith, while you should not actively rebel against the king necessarily, it is a good thing to not follow that order. And so, therefore, we can be sure that Kant would not have approved of someone like Eichmann saying, oh, I just followed orders, that was my duty, but rather that he would have said, Eichmann, your duty was to refuse an evil and unjust order, to say, okay, I might be part of this state, of this government, I will follow orders that are morally necessary or at least possible, but to commit genocide is morally impossible, so I will not take part in that. And surely Kant would have approved of someone like Tal Mitnick, the Israeli teenager who has gone to prison for many days, many months, for refusing military service, for saying, I will not take part in a genocide. Because getting drafted as such might be morally possible. Getting drafted to, let's say, defend your country from an attacker, but getting drafted to commit genocide, that is morally impossible. So you should refuse. Once again, to ask what is just, we can use this maxim of publicity. We can ask, what would happen to our maxim? Would it destroy itself if it became public? And I said earlier that active resistance, conspiring against the government, would of course work best if you don't publicize it. But as for passive resistance, as for defiance, it is obvious that by making it public, you are not really foiling your own plans, right? Like if the government commands you to take part in some crime, let's say to take part in as a soldier in an attack on the neighboring country, and you flat out publicly say, I refuse to take part in this, you might once again hurt your own private purpose, your happiness, because once it gets known that you refuse, you might get punished for that. But your objective purpose, the purpose of reason, to not engage in an injustice, that purpose is not hurt by it. And so we clearly see that this passive resistance is not unjust according to this principle. And you should not be too quick to dismiss passive resistance. Kant said if only more people had been like this commander of La Rochelle, then the massacre of the Protestants could have been avoided. Of course, people will sometimes say, oh, if just one person passively resists, this changes nothing. Then, okay, his hands stay clean, but the crime is still committed by others. This is true, surely, but the same is true if just one person actively resists. I mean, even if you resist with violence, if you are alone, you will not get far. The state apparatus will be stronger. It always requires a large enough number of people to resist. But if there is a large enough number, then surely passive resistance can work perfectly fine. I mean, then the despot could still sit on his throne, no one would throw him off that throne, but his commandments would fall on deaf ears. Which is what Kant would have preferred. I already discussed this in the lecture on the separation of powers and sovereignty. This is precisely why to him it's so important that legislative and executive power be completely separate. Maybe you cannot judge the sovereign who has the legislative power, because that would mean judging him according to his own laws. He, as the lawgiver, may be above the law, but as long as he doesn't execute his own laws, as long as somebody else is tasked with executing them, and that somebody else can be held accountable for what he does, and therefore would think twice about what laws he executes, therefore would probably resist executing unjust laws, then you can sort of nullify the despotic powers of the sovereign. And indeed, we do have examples in history of successful passive resistance. I mean, take the Danes, for example, under the Nazi occupation. And I mean, here they could even have engaged in active resistance because it was not their own state, it was not their own government, but rather it was a foreign state that occupied them. But still, they did not actively resist the Nazis, but they did so passively when the Nazis wanted to bring anti-Semitic laws into Denmark and wanted to bring the genocide of the European Jews to Denmark. The Danes made it very clear that they did not agree with this. I mean, there's the famous story of the Nazis saying the Jews now have to wear the yellow star, and the Danish government saying then our king will be the first to wear it. Indeed, Denmark is the only country under Nazi rule, more or less, where the Jews were not genocided, where only very, very few Jews died. Most Jews got away, going underground, many of them fleeing by boat to Sweden overnight. And the German occupiers themselves started not really fully following the orders from Berlin. Like there's the story that one day they were supposed to get all the Jews, but their commander-in-chief told them, well, knock on the Jews' doors, and if someone opens, then get him and deport him. But you are not to bash in any doors. So if somebody just doesn't open, then you will go on. And of course, only a few Jews who maybe weren't warned or whatever opened their doors. So here the Danes were quite successful with their passive resistance and with saving the Jews of Denmark. Something for which every aufklärt and every moral person would forever greatly respect the Danish people. If they had not thrown this respect they earned away in our present days by turning into Nazis themselves. Still, one might argue that there are instances where passive resistance is not enough and active resistance is needed. But here also, it's not so simple as Kant simply being against that. It is more nuanced than that. And indeed, Kant finds a quite clever, you might say, way to, while declaring revolutions to always be unjust, at the same time, in a way, justifying them through the back door. I mean, I already said that to him, the Republic in becoming is the box of Pandora, and if the lid is opened, you must not close it on hope. He would say that a revolution should be taken as nature's call or nature's scream for justice. So while it would be irresponsible to try to start one, considering the price you would have to pay, if one is started, we should consider that as if nature itself had demanded justice and freedom now. And what Kant says is, a revolution as such is always an injustice, not against a despot that is overthrown personally, but as such. And therefore, if the revolution is unsuccessful, it is not unjust to punish the revolutionaries for high treason. But, Kant says, if the revolution is successful and institutes a new government, then now the same is true. So, meaning that once again, if you try to overthrow this new government, even in the attempt to reinstate the old government, then now once again you are committing high treason, and it is perfectly just to punish you for that. And so the point Kant makes is that whatever government is in place, no matter how it came into government, must now be accepted as the legitimate government. So there cannot be some pretender to the throne, some prince of the old line that says, well, I am the legitimate ruler because my father or my grandfather used to rule, and overthrowing him was illegitimate, so now I have a right to overthrow this new government. Kant would say to him, you are right, overthrowing your father was an illegitimate act. Therefore, this government came into power through unjust means. But how did your father come to power? I mean, maybe he himself came to power through legitimate means because his father was already king. And maybe also his grandfather, maybe his great-grandfather. But if you go back far enough, Kant says, then no state is founded on justice. No state is founded on people in the state of nature coming together and voluntarily forming a social contract and founding a state. At the beginning, if you go back far enough, you will always find violence, Kant says. You will always find an act of injustice. But this cannot be an argument against the current government, Because once again, to live in a state, even an imperfect one, even one that was started in an unjust manner, is better than to live in the state of nature. So you better accept this state and don't try to destroy it or to revolutionize it, and thereby to throw people back into the state of nature. And this, as I say, is quite clever, because here you can say what all this talk about Kant rejecting revolutions is actually about. It is not so much about simply rejecting revolutions, it is actually about supporting the French Revolution. I mean, you have to consider Kant is writing about this mostly in his late works in the 90s, the 1790s, so when this revolution was already running its course. And he's, of course, writing in Prussia under censorship. So, of course, he has to be careful what he says. And he is mostly talking in general terms, not getting involved in day-to-day politics and events, not necessarily talking specifically about the French Revolution. But if you think about it, what he is saying can be read not as an attack, but as a defense of that revolution. Kant is essentially saying, dear Prussian government and censorship bureau, I am saying that revolutions are unjust and that it is irresponsible to start a revolution, that even if things aren't perfect, even if the government were to be despotic, the price to pay is too high. So I'm a good citizen, I'm not trying to start trouble, I don't wish to import the French Revolution to Prussia and to start anything here. But I am saying that in France itself, the revolution already happened. Yes, there too it was irresponsible. Yes, there too it was illegal. But it happened, and now there's a new government. And now it would be equally irresponsible and illegal to topple it. So you should leave France alone. And you should not try to support reactionary powers. You should not try to bring the old royal family back into power or whatever. Precisely if you don't want revolutions. If you want your own people to stay quiet and to not start a revolution in your state, it's better for you actually to teach the people that a revolution is never okay. Because if you say that it is okay against an illegitimate government, okay, you are saying the French government is illegitimate because they came to power through a revolution, and therefore it's okay to overthrow them in the name of the old regime. But somebody else might have arguments why your government is illegitimate and why you should be overthrown in the name of a better regime. So why don't we just agree to leave things as they are and to rather criticize openly so that things are reformed, but to not overthrow governments? So you can hopefully see that things are a bit more nuanced, and it would be too simple to just say, oh, Kant is for or Kant is against revolutions or whatever. Indeed, as I get closer to the end, I want to address what Kant's personal relationship or Kant's personal judgment of revolutions was. And here you will find, again, that it is quite nuanced and that it is even quite positive, quite supportive. Kant says that the revolutions that happened in the past in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, and in England were basically the three most important events for the progress of humanity towards a republic in the new age. To be clear, he is saying that before the American and French Revolution started. So nowadays, these three revolutions or revolts in the Netherlands, Switzerland, England, in the collective mind are greatly overshadowed by these two later revolutions. So just so you don't wonder why Kant is putting so much emphasis on them and not on the two later ones, this is an earlier statement by him. But still, he's saying they were what brought about the most progress in the modern age. And yet, he also says, if they had not been successful, it would have not been unjust to punish those who started them as traitors. But now that they were successful, we can be happy that here this call for nature was heard, and these revolts brought these three countries, these three nations closer to republicanism. Likewise, when the French Revolution started, Kant was very enthusiastic about it. I mean, he had his daily table where he would meet with his acquaintances and have conversations about all sorts of things. And several acquaintances relate that in his last years in the 90s, things changed a bit, because before that he would talk about all kinds of topics, and now often there was only one topic he was interested in, which was the newest developments in France, and he was almost obsessed with getting new news from there, knowing what happened there, and was really hoping for the best, for the success of the French Revolution. And not only that, he in the 1790s, there was also a revolt in Ireland against the British oppression. So that happened sort of at the same time as the French Revolution. And during that day, Kant was so enthusiastic about the French Revolution, he judged others according to their own stance towards that revolution, even changing previous judgments. So when it came to England, for a long time, Kant had a very positive opinion of England, having English merchants in Königsberg as his friends, reading lots of English literature like Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, Locke, Hume. In his earlier works, you will find him say the English are very genius. Their literature might not be the most thorough, might not be the most tasteful, the most beautifully written, but they have the most original ideas. So it's always inspiring to read them. It always gives you new ideas to think about. And you will find him saying that they have the most free, the most republican constitution of Europe. But in those later years, the English turned into the main enemies of revolutionary France, and Kant became very critical of them, and how outwardly they act as barbarians, he would say, wanting to keep every other nation under the yoke of oppression and despotism. And when this revolt in Ireland happened, Kant welcomed that, and Kant hoped for its succeeding. In private conversations, he mentioned that he hoped that the Scottish would also revolt and join the Irish, and that this might maybe overthrow the English king and the monarchy and turn England into a republic also. Now, we know that is not what happened, but that was at least what Kant was hoping for. Hopefully here you can see how superficial and shallow many of the current critics of the philosophers, not just Kant, are. They pick out particular statements of a philosopher, take them out of the whole of his work, of the whole context, and then they accuse him based on that statement, like Kant stating a revolution is always unjust. I mean, even those statements they criticize only superficially. That is only based on their own prejudices. They don't even consider the possibility that their prejudice that they already had before reading that philosopher might be wrong and that that philosopher might be right. But rather they just ask, does this philosopher agree with my opinion or not? And if not, then clearly he is wrong. They don't reflect, they don't use actual reason instead of their prejudices, asking, what does reason say? Can I justify my opinion rationally? Can the philosopher justify his statement rationally? But even with that aside, the issue is just taking a singular statement. This is precisely why I read all of Kant, all 29 volumes, and even why I read biographies written by his friends and acquaintances after his death. Because otherwise you don't get the full picture. You may read his publicized works on the philosophy of right, on the revolution, where he says it's unjust, but then you need to read his notes and his lectures to actually find that he said the revolutions in England, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland brought so much progress. And you need to read what his friends relayed about the conversations they had with him to find how enthusiastic he was about the French Revolution, how he hoped for revolts in Ireland or Scotland to turn England into a republic. And only if you take all of it together do you get the full picture. You get the picture of someone who, as a thinker, realized that revolutions are very, very dangerous, that they come with a lot of bloodshed, and often things don't even get better, at least not for a long time. Often one despotism is just replaced by another, often even by a worse despotism. And he was against revolutions in the sense that he was against the state of nature, that he said even an imperfect state, even imperfect laws are better than lawless chaos where only the strongest will prevail, whoever that happens to be. And also, of course, he had to write under the despotism of an absolute monarchy back then. But at the same time, he was for justice, for the republic, and so he welcomed progress in that direction. He would not have been so irresponsible to himself do everything to push things in that direction, no matter the cost. But if they happened to go in that direction, he welcomed that and considered it, as I said, like a call of nature for freedom. And once again, in the context of the French Revolution and of the censorship that was in place in Prussia back then, his writings against revolutions, calling revolutions illegitimate, very much must be understood as writings against the counter-revolution, against royalists trying to reinstate the old regime. But even with that, we should also acknowledge that Kant is not fully consistent with himself, that Kant has not fully worked all of this out. And this, as always, when it comes to the issues of his philosophy of right, is because he has not fully distinguished right and ethics. And this I discussed in my lecture, what is the right and what is its distinction from ethics. I said that it was Fichte who very clearly separated the philosophy of right and the philosophy of morality. Kant still, to some degree, mixes them up, and that's where lots of issues arise from. Because if you separate them, then you have no problem saying, sure, a revolution is always categorically, without exception, unjust, as it is literally an illegal act, literally breaking the law. But it is not necessarily immoral. It's not necessarily always breaking the moral law. Now, I don't want to get into what Fichte has to say here. That would be its own lecture for some other day when I will be talking about Fichte's philosophy. But what I do want to say is that Kant only says it is better to live under an imperfect law that is not fully just than to live in the state of nature, which is completely lawless and unjust. And therefore, you should not try to force improvement of the law, to force more justice through violent means, when that will bring you back into the state of nature. But what, I could ask Kant, what if the state is not only somewhat unjust, somewhat despotic, but rather fully unjust, so that this state is indeed not preferable to the state of nature? This is not something that Kant discusses. He could have, maybe, because he at some point mentions different states that people can live in. I talked about this in detail in my lecture on what is justice. He says that the true state, the just state, the republic has three elements. It has freedom, law, and force, enforcing that law. And he says that the despotic state has law and force, but no freedom. But those are not the only two possibilities he mentions. He also says you can have anarchy, where you have freedom and you have law in the state, but no force enforcing that law. And you can, of course, have the state of nature, where you have freedom without any law, which will lead to force, which then will destroy the freedom. And lastly, you can have barbarism, where you have no freedom and no law, but you have force. So the difference between despotism and barbarism would be that in both cases freedom is destroyed, but in despotism at least you have some sort of lawfulness. The laws might be despotic, they might be somewhat unjust, but at least there's some rulefulness, some regularity to the state. It's not all arbitrary. While in barbarism, you simply have the rule of the strong over the weak, and there's absolutely nothing restricting the arbitrary whims of the strong that oppress the weak. So maybe we could say that, sure, in despotism, since you have some law, you should not revolt, as that would throw you back into the completely lawless state of nature. But under barbarism, you are in a lawless state. So what do you have to lose? The state of nature is bad precisely because here not justice, not the law, but mere strength decides. Well, that's exactly what you have in barbarism, right? The rule of the strong. Still, even though Kant does mention this state of barbarism, he does so in other places, not where he discusses revolution. When it comes to the question of revolution, he seems to think only of the states of his time, so the despotic absolute monarchies of 18th century Europe. And maybe he did not think of other possibilities because he did not live to see the 20th century with its totalitarian regimes. But here we can maybe think of Hannah Arendt and her work on the origins of totalitarianism. And I have a video on my channel where I discuss Arendt's concept of totalitarianism, particularly in how it applies to Israel right now. And what Arendt says is that the totalitarian regimes of Hitler or Stalin were not simply more extreme, more oppressive forms of despotism. They were not simply different in quantity of oppression, they were different in quality altogether. Because they destroyed the state. They might have first taken over a state as a basis of operation, but essentially they break down the statehood. They break it down outwardly. Their states have no borders. They are constantly expanding. There is no other states that you would respect as your neighbors, but rather there's just territories that you have not conquered yet. And they also break down the state inwardly. They don't rule through laws, not even oppressive and unjust laws. Rather, their rule seems arbitrary. It's a rule by decree more than by law. It's a rule more of the executive than of the legislative. And in that sense, you could characterize totalitarianism as barbaric in a way. The totalitarian movements, like the Nazi movement, the Bolshevik movement, or the totalitarian parties, like a horde of barbarians that just crush everything in their way. And indeed, Arendt does characterize this in her writings as a kind of a new modern form of barbarism. So you could say that in a way, the totalitarian regimes destroyed the state, and therefore they walked us back into the state of nature, where only the strong rule. And then, of course, they, because they had a whole movement or a whole party apparatus behind themselves, were, of course, stronger than individuals or than minority groups. So you could say what is forbidden, what is illegal and unjust according to Kant, is that you, as a citizen and subject of the state, destroy the state and bring it back into the state of nature. Because even a despotic state is better than the state of nature. But what, we could ask Kant, if the state itself, or the rulers who are in charge of the state, destroy the state and throw us back into the state of nature? Revolting now would no longer be an attack on the state, because the state already has been attacked and destroyed. Now, you would just live in the state of nature and you would just be defending yourself. And so we could agree with Kant that in mere despotism, you should not start a revolution. So let's take current regimes like in Hungary or in Turkey. Sure, they are despotic. Sure, they oppress minorities like the Roma or the Kurdish people. They also oppress political opponents. They largely control the judiciary and the media. And there's a lot of repression. But still, you have some basic rights to live, to not just be imprisoned without any reason, to your property and so on. And you have some possibility to state your opinion, to protest, and therefore to maybe change things in a peaceful manner. And so here Kant would surely say, you mustn't start a revolution. But we could agree with Kant on this, but still say that, for example, the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto by the Jews was not unjust, because the Jews under the Nazis, they were essentially in the state of nature, right? They did not live under unjust, under despotic laws. They lived in a state of lawlessness. Indeed, this is what Arendt points out, that the greatest crimes, that genocide, can only happen not when you are a second-class citizen, then you are still somewhat protected by the law, but when you are completely outside any sort of legal community, when you are not a citizen at all, when you are just a human being, as free, as unbound as a wild animal that anyone can shoot. Which is why Arendt said that the most important, in a way, the only human right is not the right to live or to freedom or free speech or whatever, but the right to citizenship, because it is the right to have rights in the first place. And this has been built up and further shown by later historians, like, for example, in our day by Timothy Snyder in his work Bloodlands, who clearly shows that Jews in Western Europe, where states were occupied, taken over, but still left somewhat intact, half the Jews there survived statistically, even including in Germany itself. But in Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, the Baltics, where the states were completely destroyed, and essentially you had the lawless Wild West that is the state of nature, and the Jews did not have any citizenship at all. Here, not 1 in 2, but 1 in 20 Jews survived. And we can see the same nowadays with the Palestinians, right? Those Palestinians that are Israeli citizens, sure, they might be second-class citizens. There might be many issues in Israel. I mean, they make up like 80% of murder victims in Israel, while only making up about 20% of the population. But still, they have some rights, and even though many would like to get rid of them, and not just the fundamentalists and far-right parties in the government. I mean, there are polls where Israeli citizens are asked, and many of them would like to get rid of their Palestinian citizens. It's not so easy to get rid of someone once he is a citizen. The law protects you even as a second-class citizen to some degree. But those Palestinians that are not citizens at all, those in the West Bank or in Gaza, they are in the state of nature. They are under the barbaric rule of the stronger party, which of course is Israel right now. And so therefore, they cannot be accused of committing an injustice when they fight back, because they have no justice at all, not even an imperfect justice. We can agree with Kant that it would not be good if anyone always felt free and justified in revolting when there's some injustice. because there always is some injustice. Again, where would you draw the line? No state is absolutely perfect and just. But when there's only injustice, when you are not protected at all by the law, then who could accuse you if you revolt? If you yourself turn to violence, since the other side is also dealing with you only through violence, not through even the most unjust law. And so again, we could say in a regular despotism you must not revolt, but the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, totally justified. And while Kant does not outright say this, I would say that there are statements that Kant makes that would indeed allow us to draw this conclusion. And that would have maybe led him himself to draw this conclusion if he had known the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. For one, Kant often says a law that does not protect me cannot oblige me. So I can only expect it to follow a law if that law does not only command but also protect, right? So I mean, imagine the state of nature where there are no laws at all. You're completely unprotected. Now imagine someone coming to you and saying, well, I want to be safe from you, so I want to make it a law that you cannot murder me, and you must promise to follow this law. From now on, you have to give away your weapon. From now on, you're forbidden from murdering me. But imagine that person also saying, but I will not submit to this law, so I am still free to murder you if I want. You give up your weapon, but I keep mine. Why would you submit to such a law? Why would you give up your weapon? That would only be stupid. That would not be just, it would just be dumb. And no one can expect that from you. Now, if the other person were to say, I will also give up my weapon. If you promise to not kill me, I promise to not kill you. We will both be under the same law. That would be a different matter. But if he insists to still remain free to kill you if he wants, then the smartest thing you can do is to also insist on staying in the state of nature. Because while it is an unjust state, while it is a dangerous state, at least you may be able to protect yourself. You may be the stronger one. While if you just give up your weapons and submit to a law and let the other person rule, you are clearly from now on the weaker one and completely at the other's mercy. So you can only be expected to follow a law if the law also grants you protection, right? This does not just go for murdering. Like, the law can tell you mustn't steal from others. Well, but if you are so poor that you cannot even buy food or a roof over your head, if you are basically left to starve, then no one can blame you for stealing food to live. If the state had offered something else, like if in the state there's social security and poor people get money by the state or food stamps or whatever, then maybe we can say, okay, you should not have stolen food. That was, you were breaking the law. That was an injustice. You should follow the law that commands you to respect others' property, because the same law also makes sure that you get some property, at least enough to live off. But if the law does not protect you at all, why should you be expected to follow it? I mean, for that very reason, Kant says there might be special cases where you can do an action that under normal circumstances the law would forbid and normally would be an unjust action without being punished for it, with being excused. And that is if you are under circumstances where the law cannot protect you and where the law cannot threaten you with anything that would be worse than whatever happens to you if you don't do this action, right? So the law can say normally you mustn't kill, but let's say someone attacks you, tries to kill you, and in self-defense you have to kill him. Kant says the law cannot forbid this, because what punishment would you threaten somebody with if he defends his life through killing someone in self-defense? I mean, the worst possible punishment you could give is the death penalty. But then if he were to obey that law and not defend himself, he would also die. So that's not a threat in this situation. And that's precisely why you have to allow killing in self-defense if necessary. The same Kant says about the board of Carneades, which is a well-known problem, dilemma in legal theory, going back to antiquity, where you imagine a shipwreck and someone survives by clinging to a board, a piece of wood that drifts in the water. And now there's another survivor in the water that also wants to live, of course, but the board can only support one person. And so now the second person kicks the first person, who happens to be weaker, off the board and claims the board for himself. So now the question is, if the second person manages to reach the shore, and if somehow it comes out how he survived by kicking somebody else off that board, should he be punished for murder? And here Kant's answer is, once again, of course we could say that person is evil. Of course we could say that was immoral. But still, it would not make sense to punish him for that. Because once again, what punishment could you threaten him with? Like anything short of death, like imprisonment, would be less bad than dying, right? Then he would probably say, while drifting in the water, okay, I'm gonna kick that person off the board. They're gonna lock me away for 10 years, but if I don't do it, I'm gonna drown. So I would rather take 10 years of prison. And even if you threaten the death penalty, that's just equally bad as what he would get if he doesn't kick that person off the board. So here Kant would say, the law cannot protect me. The law cannot save my life, right? The law that says don't kill that other person, don't shove him off that board, cannot offer me my own board. And so therefore the law can also not oblige me. The law can only be in place for me if it has something to offer for me. Otherwise, I cannot be expected to follow it. And if you apply this thought to, let's say, a completely lawless, a completely totalitarian regime, let's say that is engaged in genocide, a regime that has nothing to offer you, not even living as a second-class citizen, then you could not be expected to follow that regime's laws and to not rebel against it. I mean, the whole question for the right, for the philosophy of right, that it has to answer to Kant is, how can several free, autonomous, rational beings live alongside each other? Well, in the case of the board of Carneades, nature says they can't. They can't live alongside each other peacefully. There is only a board for one person to survive. And so therefore, the right is silent here. The law has nothing to say here. And this we can, I would say, apply to a totalitarian situation. Also, as a last point, that is also interesting in this context, what Kant has to say about slavery. Kant was, of course, against slavery. And he says, if we have slavery, then we are turning people, at least legally, into items. Here you can go back to my lecture on the different types of legal relations, where I said that to Kant, in legal terms, everything that exists is either a person or an item. A person is a rational being that has autonomy, and an item is not. So everything from a lifeless object like a stone to an animal is an item. This often gets criticized because people misunderstand it, as if Kant would say the animal is exactly like the stone, as if he was saying it's not sentient, it does not feel pain when you abuse it or whatever. But that's not the point. The point is just that it has no autonomy, no rationality. It cannot set its own purposes. It just follows the laws of nature, it follows its instincts, and therefore it has no dignity. But he says about animals and how to treat them, by the way, I will soon discuss in a separate lecture. But the point is, everything is a person or an item. Human beings, since they are rational, should be treated as persons and therefore as free, as autonomous. In slavery, we reduce them to items, which we shouldn't do, which is immoral. But if we do it, then in legal terms, they really have to be considered as items. And what does that mean? Well, Kant says there's an item right and there's personal right. Item right you have when you own an item, like your house, your car, including, once again, an animal, your dog. A personal right you have when you own not a person, because that would be slavery, but certain actions of a person. When you made a contract with someone and that someone promised you certain actions to work for you in a certain way or whatever. And the item right means not that you have a right towards that item. It means that you have a right towards other persons in regards to that item, right? If I own a house, what it means essentially is that I have a right towards other people in regards to that house. Other people must not enter, must not occupy that house, must not tear down that house without my permission. But it does not mean that I have a right towards that house as such. I mean, the house is just an item. It's an object, not a person. So if the house were to break down, I could not sue the house. Maybe if I had a contract with workers and an architect who built the house for me, maybe I can sue them for doing bad work, but it would not make sense to sue the house, right? Likewise, if my car breaks down, or if my car, because I did not put in the brakes, happens to start rolling down a hill when I parked it there, or if my dog does not follow my commands, or if my dog happens to run away from me, I cannot sue my car or my dog. That would be ridiculous. If somebody else steals my car or bashes in my car windows, or if somebody else steals my dog or shoot him, I can sue that person, because The item right means I have an exclusive right to that item. I have the right to tell everyone else to stay away from that item. But it does not mean that I have a right towards that item as such, because an item is not a legal person. I cannot take an item as such to court. The item has no rights. It can be possessed, but precisely for that reason, it has also no duties, right? Again, a law that does not protect me cannot oblige me. Items are not protected by the law. They are not obliged by the law. So, Kant says, what this means for slavery is, if we turn a human being into an item in legal terms, then afterwards, we cannot treat him legally like a person and say that he has obligations. Since he has no rights, he also has no duties. And that means the slave who runs away is like the dog or the cat or the bird who gets away from his owner. You cannot blame him. You cannot sue him. You cannot say, oh, but he was legally obliged through his contract to be mine and to stay in my possession. You can, of course, try to get him back. You can run after him. But you cannot sue him. And likewise, even if your dog bites you, you cannot sue him. You cannot say that the dog harmed your rights. Maybe a dog that is too savage, that keeps biting people, will be put down to protect people. But that is not a punishment as such. That is not the death penalty because the dog broke some law. That is just protecting yourself from a piece of nature, so to say. And in the same way, Kant would say, if a slave rises up and kills his master, sure, the other masters, because they happen to be stronger, might use their strength to punish the slave, to kill him in retribution. But this is not a legal proceeding. This is just both being in the state of nature, so being in a war against each other, and just the stronger side doing whatever it wants. But you cannot say that the slave who killed his master broke the law, committed an injustice. He's outside of the law. The laws don't apply to him. And so you cannot say that the slave has a right to rise up against his master and to kill his master. He does not have a positive right. That is, he's not allowed to do it. There's no law saying he can do this. But at the same time, you cannot say that the slave has no right to do this, that he is forbidden from doing it. Rather, he is simply outside of any rights or any prohibitions. And this, what Kant says about slavery, I think once again we can apply to the question of revolution. If the state is merely despotic, if I'm still a subject of the state, still a citizen of the state, although with limited rights, but still somewhat protected by the law, I should not revolt. Okay. But I would say, expanding up in Kant, if I merely have the status of a slave, having no rights at all, being reduced from personhood to an item, then I'm not committing an injustice by revolting. And here once more, I point you to Hannah Arendt, because Arendt describes totalitarianism as essentially destroying personhood, essentially trying to turn human beings from persons into mere objects. And she does indeed also describe it in terms of slavery. She says that people in totalitarianism live under such conditions as slaves in antiquity used to live. So she says that in a way, the totalitarianism of the 20th century is not a completely new form of government. It existed even in antiquity, but back then it only ever applied to certain groups of people. And that is precisely why it was not noted, why it was not described as its own form of government, because of course those people who talked about politics were free people and they didn't care what happened to the slave. They didn't bother contemplating their condition. So the new thing is not the form of ruling as such in totalitarianism. The new thing is that it applies not to a specific class of slaves, but that it is applied to everyone. That suddenly everyone is treated like a slave and there are no free citizens at all. But still, Arendt does describe it in terms of slavery. And since Kant says the slave is not committing an injustice by murdering his master, we could agree with Kant that revolutions in despotic regimes are unjust and should be avoided, and still say that in a totalitarian regime, trying to rise up against Hitler or against Stalin would not be an injustice, because you don't live in a state, you live in the state of nature. You live under conditions of barbarism. You live under the rule not of an unjust law, but of completely barbaric force and violence. And here you could respond with violence. But this is what Kant has to say about the question of revolution. And with that, I am at the end of my lectures on Kant's theory of states right. I talked about how should the state be, what is the state for, why do we even need a state, what should the state do with criminals, how should the state be run, and now I talked in 2 lectures about how should the state be improved, how can we get from despotism to the republic. The public right has 2 more levels in Kant's theory. There's not just state right, there's also the right of nations, so international right or international law. And above that, there's cosmopolitan right. And I want to talk about these 2 levels also. And I think as a transition, it makes sense to talk about the postures we should take, for one, towards the state. That would be the posture of patriotism. And then on the other hand, that the posture that we should take that goes beyond the state, and that would be cosmopolitanism. And so these 2 is what I want to discuss next, before then turning to the right of nations and the cosmopolitan right. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk Bilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.